Okay, so hi everybody and welcome to our panel discussion on building evidence synthesis capacity for agri-food systems. So agri-food systems are one of the areas in which the evidence synthesis community as a whole is less well developed. So we thought that this panel discussion would be useful to see how things are developing within our area, but also to think about any lessons that we can learn from other fields, but also other people setting up working in evidence synthesis in less established fields as well, any lessons that people might learn from us. So I'm Nicola Randall, Professor of Evidence-Based Agriculture and Agroecology at Harper Adams University, and I'll be chairing the session. And you can see I have colleagues with me on the panel who will introduce themselves individually as they introduce their talks. So we're going to start with Andrea Schievano, who's going to present a few minutes on work he's been doing for the EU JRC. Each of us will present a few minutes on a particular initiative, and then we'll open up a panel discussion to think about the capacity building more widely. So Andrea, if I could pass over to you to kick us off, that would be great.
Hello, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, very well. So thank you for inviting Nicola and colleagues. I'm Andrea Schievano. I'm let's say a former researcher in the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. I just quit my experience there last month, and now I'm, let's say, an independent researcher. But what I will show here, it's very quickly, it's the work we have been doing at the Joint Research Center in these past 5 years, well, 6 years actually. Let me see if I can share my screen, or maybe, yeah, screen better. Can you see it? Do you see my presentation here?
Yes, we can, Andrea. Sorry, I was muted.
Okay. If you see the presentation, then it's fine. Okay, so what we have been doing at the JRC is somehow looking at, let's try to review as quick as possible a very large set of sustainable farming practices that are somehow included in the common agriculture policy objectives. And the request we got from our policymakers was really broad. And so what we ended up doing was using the systematic review process to screen the existing meta-analysis published in the literature regarding a very large set of sustainable farming practices. So we basically mapped the existing evidence at the level of synthesis, at the level of meta-analysis. We screened, starting from 2020, where the project was started, we screened around 14,000 abstracts, more or less, and we ended up with around 630 meta-analyses selected using several selection criteria. And we basically extracted as much as we could, qualitative and quantitative information regarding the effects of these farming practices and the moderators that were studied by the authors of these meta-analysis. And we this is somehow a list of the main categories of farming practices that were searched in the literature. You see some of them, for instance, agroforestry systems were one of the first categories we have been screening, and it's in 2020. So of course, the distribution of the selected meta-analysis is not covering the last 4 or 5 years, because we could eventually update while the latest searches were in 2023 and eventually 2024. Now, for instance, we are in the process of updating agroforestry systems. So we run again the search of agroforestry in 2024, and we found basically double meta-analysis as compared to what was found in 2020. So let's say the trend here is literature is really accumulating a lot. Also, synthesis literature is accumulating, and the message we got out of this is that basically we should update continuously these kind of exercises of synthesis, either at synthesis level or at primary level. What we built is this JRC evidence library that you may see here. I see there's a problem here with my bar, but anyways. And this evidence library is basically reporting at least let's say a qualitative overview and map of the available results coming out from all these 600 and so meta-analysis. We of course we categorized the results and classified results into different farming practices categories. We used classification that comes from the JRC and the European Commission, let's say, policy context, as well as for the outcomes, so the impacts, environmental and the agriculture productivity impacts. We classified them in these main categories using some the nomenclature of the food system monitoring framework in the published still by some other JRC colleagues recently. And yeah, so the library is somehow open to navigation, to several definitions of these classes of farming practices and outcomes. And so one may look at more detailed combinations. So you may have we have three different levels of classification for practices and for outcomes, and we also I mean, according to the selection, you may have somehow an overview of what is the evidence, also in terms of qualitative information, whether the effects are significantly positive, negative, or there's no significance. And eventually, if there is also some evidence, but it's not properly statistically studied, so we still kept track of those non-quantitative systematic reviews published. And yeah, so the library carries also some qualitative information and synthesis information, so regarding information regarding the practices on the one side and also the outcomes on the other side. And we have also this dashboard that reports the quantitative effect sizes where they were extracted, and some these wiki sections where we report synthesis of each of these meta-analyses. You may also go to follow the link and go to the original paper eventually. And also we screened the quality of so we assessed the quality of these synthesis studies and meta-analysis using a framework of quality criteria that were previously published by other frameworks. Yeah, so we have already some published outcomes here. So the main data set published in Scientific Data 2 years ago. Now we are handling a new version of the data set, and so this platform published, and also several other policy briefs and analysis undergoing. Okay, I don't know, Nicola, how much time I would have eventually to get more detailed overviews or not.
I think we'd better leave it there, but that's fantastic. Thank you. That's given us a really good overview. And I think if people have got specific questions on the database, maybe they can come back to you afterwards.
Maybe just
so, yeah.
I may add, if I have a few seconds, I may add only one aspect. So what we are trying now to do is to classify results based not only on single farming practices, but how much these practices are grouped together into systems of practices using the agroecological framework, also which kind of practices in terms of agroecological level. So if it is simply increase efficiency or substitute conventional practices, or maybe redesign the agro ecosystem. And we are trying to map the literature using this agroecology diversification index. So how much basically is the let's say the management looks like an agroecological approach rather than single practices. And we are trying to find out how literature is distributed for more complex and diversified agroecology approaches. We see that at least at the level of synthesis literature, we have many knowledge gaps. I think that's quite an interesting point of view for discussion later on.
Yeah, really useful. Thank you so much. So I think that's a fantastic start to show us, how you can, I think partly how broad policy questions are, but a really good way of how we can address it by bringing together lots and lots of different pieces of information and presenting them in a really user-friendly way as well. Thanks very much, Andrea. So I'm going to move straight to Adrien now, if that's okay, who's going to be building on this idea of collecting information and how we measure impact to inform policy. Thanks, Adrien. Over to you. Please do remember to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adrien de Pierrepont. First, thank you very much for the invitation. It's very honored to be here. So I work for a French consultancy company called Adrien. We are specialized in the evaluation of the common agricultural policy. And we are part of what we call the European Evaluation Help Desk for the CAP, which is a group of experts working with the European Commission, DG Agri, to assist them and help them to develop evaluation tools and to perform some evaluation work. And within this evaluation help desk for the CAP, we've been involved for a few years now in a series of studies aiming at quantifying the impacts of the CAP and the CAP strategic plans on different environmental aspects. So as you may know, the Common Agricultural Policy has environmental objectives, whether it is for mitigating greenhouse gases emissions or improving soil health, for instance. And one of the needs of DG Agri and the different managing authorities implementing the CAP in their member states, one of the needs is to be able to really monitor, quantify the impacts of the CAP on these environmental aspects, to really know if the CAP achieved its objectives or not, to be able to have quantified objectives and to be able to know if the CAP achieved these objectives. And to this regard, we've started to develop to work on these studies. So building on the work that Andrea just presented to you. So it means we've used the quantitative data of the GRC Farming Practice Evidence Library to try to quantify the impact of the CAP strategic plan. So we looked at the different interventions planned by member states in their CAP strategic plans, and we looked at the farming practices supported by these interventions. And then based on the GRC Farming Practice Evidence Library, we identified the impact of these farming practices on different environmental aspects to be able to, in the end, add up all of the impacts of each individual farming practices supported by the CAP to have an overview of the global, the overall impact of the Common Agricultural Policy. So first, we've started on climate, meaning that the first study we've performed was on to quantify really the impact of the CAP on greenhouse gases mitigation and carbon storage. And now we are working on soil, so we look at the impact of the CAP on soil organic carbon storage again, but also soil nitrogen, nitrogen leaching and runoff, soil erosion by water, soil water retention capacity, and soil packing density. And this is very challenging, as we may discuss later, because so the data from the GRC farming practice evidence library, and more generally the scientific evidence on the effects of farming practices is very diverse. I mean the way it is reported and the units measured, the metrics are very diverse. And what we had to do, one of the main challenge of the study was to really harmonize all of the indicators we had available. And it meant that sometimes we had to make very big approximations, or sometimes even we were not able to use some of the evidence gathered because the metric was too far from what we intended to use. So it's one of the main challenges we've encountered. And so obviously at this stage, the result of these studies, they are not very let's say robust because of all the data gaps. But I think the interesting thing about these studies is that it really points out the needs for policy evaluation, the needs in terms of scientific evidence for the effect of farming practices, to really feed these evaluations and to have more robust assessment of the impact of the CAP.
That's great. Thanks very much, Adrien. So, I think the key themes there are really the thinking about how reporting and measurement of particularly agri-environmental variables, are so varied, and how we need to, build on that. We need that scientific evidence and we need it standardized in order to really inform policy. So really nice to highlight some of those key challenges. Thank you. So I'm going to pass straight to Lynn now, who's going to be talking about how evidence can be used for a very specific practical purpose. So thanks, Lynn, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Lynn Dix. I'm a professor of ecology at the University of Cambridge, and I work on biodiversity and agricultural landscapes and evidence synthesis for conservation of biodiversity and in agriculture. I'm actually going to go a bit more general than that because I thought it would be useful to just give a few thoughts. I don't have any slides about how to get evidence used in real decisions. And for me, and I think for everybody who works in evidence synthesis, people will realise that in order to get evidence used, the evidence has to be presented to decision makers in a format that they can make use of. It has to be usable, it has to be relevant to them, and it also has to be flexible, so they can take the evidence that they're interested in and not all the other evidence. And there are some problems that are specific to agriculture, I think, when it comes to getting evidence used, which have already been raised by Adrien and Andrea, and that is the practices. The evidence is often just individual practices. You have lots of evidence and meta-analyses on individual farm management practices, but farms don't usually just practice one thing, right? They have a farming system. They're combining multiple practices, and the evidence, when you start to look at it through combining multiple practices, you might be able to see the effect of an entire system change, like organic farming, but in that evidence, you don't know which practices were involved. So generally, this is the biggest challenge, that the lack of data on how practices combine and where the synergies are and where the trade-offs are between different practices. So I think there are two different ways to get evidence like this used in real decisions. One is, and both of them involve kind of building some kind of tool or infrastructure or software that users can access the evidence. And you can either do that by building a user interface that is just an interface to the evidence, and that's what the JRC evidence library does really well. You have all the evidence really laid out, you have it beautifully visualized, you can select the different practices you're interested in, you can very quickly see where the evidence is, and you can dig down into the details of it. And the other way, so that's one way, you build your own user interface that links to the evidence. And the other way to do it is to to put the evidence into tools that the decision makers are already using, or decision makers have designed for themselves, right? And so the other example, my example of that is something that I've been working on for many years called the Cool Farm Biodiversity Metric, which started as a greenhouse gas calculator, farm scale greenhouse gas calculator, very widely used by companies who want to report, and farms and farmers and in supply chains who wanted to report their greenhouse gas emissions based on farm management. And we worked with the user community to build a version of that to look at biodiversity management on farms. And it was absolutely user-centered design. So what do you want it to look like? How will it be used? What do you need? And inside that, so what we have, the Cool Farm Biodiversity Metric, is a set of questions and answers about how you manage your farm for biodiversity. But we've built the evidence into it. So when you select a set of actions that you do, you have field margins, you manage them like this, you include crop rotation, you grow legumes sometimes, those kind of actions. Where there's evidence for that, it changes the score. So you get an overall set of scores for how good your biodiversity management is relative to how good it could be. And the evidence, the actions that are supported by evidence get a little bit of a boost on the score because they're supported by evidence. And that score comes from something called the Conservation Evidence Database, which is which is one of those kind of tools I talked about before, an interface to the evidence. It's a compilation of all of the conservation studies that have tested actions and reported outcomes. Those actions have the evidence compiled and given a category based on an expert assessment, which is either beneficial or likely to be beneficial or doesn't work or we don't know. And those categories get put into, very simply translated into scores, into either 0, 1 or 2 or -1 in the Cool Farm Biodiversity Metric. But it's important to say that we couldn't have made the Cool Farm Biodiversity Metric entirely evidence-based because it would only have allowed us to have 20% of the possible actions, because we just didn't have the evidence. Either there is no evidence or it hasn't been compiled in the right way. So we would have, so most of the content of that tool is actually based on judgment. Where there is evidence, the score is weighted to reflect that. So that's an example of putting the evidence into a tool that's already being designed and in use. Now in about 2016, well, it was in 2016, led by David Rose, I did some work looking at how farmers use decision support tools and how to design them better to increase their uptake. And in the process of doing that, we started cataloguing all the decision support tools that British farmers use. And we got to 395 different ones, and then we stopped because the list was too long. So we found that all the advisors we spoke to, and most of the farmers were, about half of the farmers were using decision support tools. But when we dug really deeply and we were using interviews and quantitative data into finding out what promotes uptake, what are the things that make a tool more likely to be used. And we identified 15 factors. One of them is relevance to the user. One of them is how well does it perform? How cost effective is it? But another really important one is it compatible with compliance demands? So there was one tool in this piece of research that everybody who used it absolutely hated. They thought it was completely rubbish, really difficult to use, really annoying, but everybody used it because they had to, because it was part of the regulation that they did. So my conclusion from all of this is that if we want people to use evidence in agriculture, we have to incorporate the evidence into pre-existing tools, especially or preferably those tools that they are forced to use because they have to for some other reason. That's all. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thanks for that, Lynn. Really thought-provoking and useful. Thank you. So I'm going to go straight to Damien now, who's going to be probably taking us back away from tools and thinking about meta-analyses and how we might actually carry out evidence syntheses. Over to you.
Hello, everybody. Do you hear me? Do you see my screen? Is it okay? Okay, perfect. I will change first screen. Full screen. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon. My name is Damien Beillouin. I'm a researcher at CIRAD, so French organism for research. I'm currently based in West Indies. Since now 6 years, I'm working on agronomy, on statistics, and particularly on second-order meta-analysis to support evidence-based agricultural and food transitions. Why do we use second-order meta-analysis? So first question, what is second-order meta-analysis? A second-order meta-analysis is a meta-analysis of meta-analysis. So we synthesize already synthesis. So we have a very global overview. And why is it useful? Because now we all know that there is an increase in explosion in number of primary studies published, but there is also now in agricultural environmental science an explosion of meta-analysis. So for policymakers, for scientists, it's very difficult to have a global overview for all this knowledge. So here, second-order meta-analysis offer, for the given amount of time, a broader scope than first-order meta-analysis. They can cover many interventions, many outcomes. They also offer a very large data volume because we are focusing on synthesizing already synthesis. We are already at a higher level, so we can combine very large volume of data. And doing a second-order meta-analysis is exactly the same as doing a first-order meta-analysis if we focus on the mean effect size. So this tool could be useful. And we try to use these methods since now 4 or 6 years. We synthesize over 600 meta-analyses. And here are some examples of main results. For example, on the effect of crop desertification. For example, here we show that crop yield increased by 40% when we applied crop desertification compared to non-crop desertification. We also showed that the pest and disease control increased by 63%, and we also show that soil quality increased by 30%. On all these numbers are based on high number of per observation. And these numbers are quite, maybe not so innovative, but I think that were quite useful and quite impactful for policymakers, at least in France, because policymakers didn't know how useful were crop desertification. So putting these numbers with high confidence, with a lot of data, with high statistical robustness, I think is very useful to discuss, to exchange with the policymakers to make our points. And we also are trying, or we have applied this second-order meta-analysis to agroforestry with Andrea on soil organic carbon, on biodiversity, and climate impact. So we are applying this on different subjects. Another utility of, I think, of this high-level synthesis is we also can map the evidence. And typically, I think it's very also useful and very important to know where are the geographical biases. For example, on crop desertification, we show that there is very few studies in Africa. So it's very difficult for us to make some recommendations, some advice on Africa. Or if we do so, it's not fully supported. So we have to be very careful on policymakers also to be careful not to apply some high-level results or synthetic results to any studies, any location, because sometimes it's not so right to do this. And after that, we can also identify population intervention control on outcome blind spots. And again, for the crop desertification, we show that we do not have many studies on water use and profitability. But profitability, for example, is the main question. It's very important, but science have not handled, have not taken into account this subject. So it's very important to know this so that we can advise such a scientist on future project on these particular topics. So second-order meta-analysis could be, I think, useful, but they are not perfect. Far from that. I think the main disadvantages of this, and we already discussed a bit of this, is we have a loss of resolution. We are dependent on the quality on the moderator used in first-order meta-analysis. So if first-order meta-analysis only present a mean effect size, we cannot go further than that. We cannot add, for example, the impact of different climate, or different soil, and different things on the main effects. So that could be a big problem. We also have to handle redundancy. For example, one primary study can be used in different meta-analyses. And so that we have to consider carefully this, not to have wrong results. And so it's not so easy to consider this redundancy. On another point that I think is very important, at least for scientists, is that we know that there is a very different level of quality in synthesis. We know that there is sometimes very good primary studies and good first-order meta-analysis, and sometimes the first-order meta-analysis are not so good. So we have to consider this different quality when we aggregate this and we calculate the mean effect size. On another point, the last point, as also says, there is an exponential growth in the number of primary studies, meta-analysis, and so on. So when we publish meta-analysis, we know that after 2, 3, 4, 5 years, this meta-analysis is not up to date. So maybe the results are not the right one anymore. So we have to update continuously this work. And I will finish with this final message. I think second-order meta-analysis are a powerful tool and could be very useful, but we have still to work on some points to increase the impact. And I think it's very important to increase the transparency and traceability of those methods, because yes, it's very important to have high quality, high transparency and fair principles on the studies, to share our data, to make all data available, publicly available, and so on. It's very important, I think. Second point, it's very important to embrace variability. As we already said, having only one mean effect size, one global effect size, one global effect across all, the world or Europe or France, it might be not enough, because we know that there is a lot of variety in climate, in soil, in agricultural practices, and so on. So we have to go deeper and we have to embrace variability. I think another point very important, as you may notice, is I think we have different teams working in parallel, and I think it will be better to try to foster collaboration, try to avoid extracting in each people extracting their own effect size on doing their own meta-analysis. I think it's better to work together and to have very strong results together. On the last point, I think we also try to develop some platform to display the results of meta-analysis, to continuously update the results of meta-analysis. It's the Impact for Soil platform focused on soil organic carbon. On this platform, we're built with scientists and policymakers, try to make a point where different people meet and different people can exchange and learn from each other. Yes, because I think it's very important not only to present raw scientific results, but also to translate it into more common language and to know how people will receive it. Yes, that's it for me.
Thanks very much, Damien. That's really useful and interesting that we're all raising similar issues, even if it's in different ways. And I think this is something we can sort of build on in the discussion. So some of the things you've raised are sort of similar to issues that others have raised earlier on. So I'm going to finish off the excuse me, presentation part just with a very brief presentation on a new network that we're trying to build for evidence syntheses in agri-food. So I will just go to my screen quickly to do that. Can everybody see my screen? I can't actually see you now, so if someone could just unmute and just let me know, that would be great.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, great, thank you. Perfect, thank you. So yeah, so building capacity and evidence synthesis. So clearly we've got lots of very exciting initiatives going on, lots of really important work, as we've demonstrated here. And I think one of the things to think about is that agri-food is very multidisciplinary.
Nicola, maybe you could still click on full screen so we could see, because some slides are hidden. Yeah. Okay. Much better.
Okay.
Yeah, and eventually click on
so
hide.
If I do it like that, is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine. There's only a bar with hide to be like the Zoom bar that you could click on hide eventually if you see it. Maybe you don't see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I've got rid of that, I think. Is that better? So can you see that okay now?
Yeah, that's fine. Fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, so most of the work that we as panelists have talked about would fall under really the area that the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence hosts. So these different collaborations provide guidance, they provide publications, they develop methods and support, and they're really important when we're thinking about trying to build capacity and efficiency of evidence syntheses. But in actual fact, if we think about agri-food systems, as I say, many of them would fall into the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, but also we have topics that might fall into social sciences, which tends to be administered by Campbell at the bottom here, or by or have human health impacts. So that multidisciplinarity may also sometimes be an issue when we're trying to think about building a community in evidence synthesis. And I think we want to be trying to work with these existing collaborations as much as possible, but also think about how the agri-food community can build that evidence synthesis capacity. So this slide here is some outcomes from a 2019 workshop that was funded by CABI, really thinking about what are the issues in agricultural evidence synthesis and how we might, what actions we might carry out. So we can see from this that we were really thinking about building scale, thinking about barriers, thinking about accessibility, all the things that have just been talked about just now. And that was then broken down into some priorities. I'm not going to go into them all. And some actions that we could take to try to address some of those aims and priorities. So thinking about methods, sharing good practice, sharing methods, producing perhaps specific methods that are more focused on agri-food systems, and how we might engage with target audiences. And again, we've talked about that. Thinking about providing training, guidance, for example, and linking and learning from others, which hopefully is something we're doing here as being part of the ESMARConf. So moving on, we, as an outcome of that, one of the things a group of people across Europe did was to try to apply for funding to actually build a network. And last year, we were successfully funded by EU COST, who funded action to establish an international network to support and promote the use of evidence synthesis in agri-food systems. So you can see the objectives here: raise awareness among decision makers and academia about the value of evidence synthesis, enhance European capacity for delivery of robust evidence synthesis, and facilitate the use of evidence synthesis for informed decision making. So for those of you that don't know about COST, it's a European funding, comes through Horizon and other sources, and it funds network building rather than research. So in order to carry out the research, in order to identify the questions that we need the network. And the network at the moment has, this is a month or so out of date, these figures, I haven't had a chance to update them, but as of last month, 174 members were part of the this network. So as you can see, you don't have to be in the EU to be part of the network. It may be that you can't apply for funding to attend events. You might have to self-fund to attend some of the events. But if you're interested in agri-food evidence synthesis, you may want to think about joining the network. The only caveat is that you have to be part of an organisation that's recognised by the EU. There's 5 working groups in the network. So group 1 is looking at assessing the current state of evidence synthesis in agri-food. We can see there's lots of exciting things going on, but we often don't know what each other are doing. Improving competencies, that might be delivering training, for example, and we've delivered one training course already. We're identifying training needs at the moment for further courses. Developing and identifying new methods, that's not necessarily identifying methods that are new to agri-food, although we might need to do that. It might be using methods that are already available rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. Capacity building with decision and policymakers, and community building and dissemination and communication, something that most of the panelists have already touched on. So if you're interested in helping build this capacity and evidence synthesis in the agri-food sector, you can join working groups. There may be spaces on the management committee. There's 2 members per country, per member state, and you can attend or get funding for various different events. So these are just some of the events that are running this year: training schools, conferences, short-term scientific missions where you can apply for funding to go elsewhere, hackathons, policy engagement activities. And you can see the website and our LinkedIn there, and the QR code there takes you to the COST Action website, so you can apply to join if you so wish. And I think that's it from me, yes. Okay, so let me stop sharing. Am Am I still sharing or have I stopped sharing?
You're not sharing anymore.
Stopped.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. So, yeah, so a quick whiz through some of the different initiatives that we've been doing in agriculture and in agri-food. So what I wanted to do now is to, if there are any participants that have questions, please drop them into our Q&A, or if you're on YouTube, I think there's a possibility for you to send them in the chat, in Slack, I think. And in the meantime, I want to really kick off the discussion by asking the rest of the panel. By the way, unfortunately, Lynn has had to leave for another meeting, so she's not able to take part in this second part. So I was about to open this up, but I can see that Ryan has put a note in for Damien to answer a question. So Damien, perhaps could you just present that question, because I'm not sure what it is.
Okay,
if you
so the question was, how do you assess the quality within second order reviews? Can you do something similar to critical appraisal at its level? So yes, I think it's quite interesting subject. On many authors try to develop some quality criterion. So typically we have a list of criterion, and we check if the criterion is okay or not. For example, how do the meta-analyses perform the search? Do they use one or different search Google Scholar, Web Science, and so on. And how do they do the statistical analysis, and so on and so on. So we develop a series of criterion, and we check for each of them. And I think, again, the same, I think different teams have developed their own criterion, their own list. And now we're trying to merge and to have a very global overview of all these criterion, to have a very standardized and organized list of criterion to evaluate quality in a right way and in the same way.
Okay, great, thank you. So going back to more general questions, and if anybody sees any other questions come in, please do let me know. But I just wanted to raise the first question. I think that we've touched a lot on challenges. I wonder if each of us could just say what you think the primary challenge is, just one challenge. And then I can see Ryan's got his hand up. So maybe if we could each just do one challenge, and then we'll go to Ryan, because presumably Ryan's probably got some other questions. So Andrea, I'm going to start with you. What do you think is the biggest challenge for agricultural evidence syntheses?
There are many, I think. But well, I think one of the big challenges that we face now is data availability and interoperability, I would say. So first of all is to really go towards a fair principle, so called, right? So really, if over these 600 and plus meta-analysis that we have been screening in the JRC farming practices evidence library, we found only, let's say, 20% of them. So like, let's say 100 or so were publishing the original data behind the analysis. The rest, either the data were published in a really rough and, I don't know, in PDF format or with few things, and or not at all. So this is, I think, the main challenge for at least in the scientific community, right, is really stopping double work and redoing the same things, every one of us, because I think there is a huge overlap between different meta-analyses. People are extracting the same things many times. This, I think, your effort in capacity building and really trying to merge efforts together, avoiding repeating things, and trying to have similar or compatible formats for data, that's really one of the huge challenges we have. over a short time.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, so accessing that raw data is really key, and redundancy as well, where people are repeating. And Damien, again, you touched on that as well, didn't you? I'm just going to quickly go to Ryan in case it's anything urgent, or is it okay for us to carry on with this question, Ryan, and then come back to you?
We can carry on with this question and then come back to it.
Okay, great. So Adrien, I'll go to you next. Have you got anything to add from what Andrea said?
Yes, I must agree with Andrea. From my perspective, interoperability of the data is one of the, the main challenge that we faced in our studies. And I also really agree with what Lynn said about having the data fit for the tools already in place, and especially the tools to monitor the existing policies. In the frame of the CAP, you have specific impact indicators to monitor the impact of the CAP. You also have in the future soil monitoring law a list of indicators. And for the purpose of policy evaluation, it's important to have scientific evidence precisely linked to these indicators to be able to monitor the impact of the policy. So yeah, I think it's one of the key, for us at least, it was one of the key challenges. And also having data that is, when we look at, for instance, soil conditions data and effect sizes, scientific evidence that is adapted to the local pedoclimatic context. And this is the issue we had with most of the meta-analysis we used. We based our analysis on, it's because the meta-analysis gathered data from all around the world, and sometimes not even including European trials. So yes, data availability is another key challenge.
Yeah, and it can be very biased to particular regions, can't it?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, great. So Damien, I can see you've put something in the chat, but I don't think any of the audience can see that. So did you want to just expand on that?
Yes, I think we all agree that there is a data availability problem on not all meta-analysis published data. So I think it will be difficult to handle the situation if the editors of journals are not aware of this. I know there is some editors that are well aware of this and are insisting on aligning the quality of the paper, but some other, and there is many journals. So I think it could be useful to try to develop some standards forced to publish primary data, the data with meta-analysis. I think the way to go forward in this situation, but I don't know if it's possible, difficult or not, but yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. And actually, we've been doing some work looking at meta-analyses at the moment, collating some meta-analyses, and sometimes you can't even tell which countries the individual studies in the meta-analyses have got their data from, because the meta-analyses don't report it. So yeah, it's an issue all the way through, I think, from primary research through to people carrying out syntheses, isn't it? Ryan, I think you might have another question for us.
Yeah, I'll go in order of the ones that were asked. Wolfgang asks a question for Damien. Instead of doing second order meta-analysis, should we not rather strive for living meta-analysis that are continuously updated? Or what would you say are the advantages of the two approaches?
Oh, you're muted, Damien.
Sorry, what are the two approaches? Second order meta-analysis and the other, sorry?
The second order and the living meta-analysis.
Yeah,
Yes.
living databases continuously updated from new primary evidence, right?
Yes, I think I think we can in the website where I show the impact for the platform, it's a living review of second order meta-analysis. So we gather second order meta-analysis and we try to gather new second order meta-analysis. So I think living reviews, living platforms are also useful for second order meta-analysis, but also for primary studies. I think, to be honest, I think second order meta-analyses are only useful because not all people publish their data. If we have access to all the primary data, I think it will be much better to gather all the primary data, so have a very big database of primary studies and analyzing it directly. The main problem is that as not also publish the data, we are forced to do second order meta-analysis. So it's not a perfect solution, it's a workaround. But yes, so yes, labeling review, I think it's a way forward because but it's very difficult to put in place because as we know, we have some scientific projects and we are working for 1 year, 2 years, and after we go for another subject, so it's very difficult. But I think for policymakers, it's always continuation of the relationship, continuation of the information. It's much better. So yeah, I'm not sure I totally answer the question. On Andrea, I think you can also have some information on this.
No, I mean, what I can add is just what Damien said. I mean, ideally, the best thing to do is recompile the primary evidence with all the information in the right place. But that's a very hard task. Until now, what we see is very scattered information and missing. Everyone calls variables differently. And so ideally, I think it's a longer process. Doing second order meta-analysis, actually, I think it's a quicker way to get some more general answers, I would say. Less detailed and less specific answers, but still the big trends, the big answers, the main things that you could conclude about some, the effects of farming practices in general, and also a map of what's there somehow.
Yeah, really useful. Yeah, thank you both. Ryan, is there another question for us?
Yes, Kate has put in the chat, really interesting. I wonder if you have any thoughts about how evidence synthesizers in agri-food engage with commercial determinants that influence primary literature.
Okay, so I'm not quite sure what she means by commercial determinants. I think for me, one of the issues with data is that often commercial trials, for example, are behind, they're not made public. And I think that certainly probably influences our evidence reviews. If we're thinking about evidence with other decision making, so commercial influences, for example, then I guess my answer to that would be an evidence synthesis in agriculture, as is probably similar in many other disciplines. The evidence synthesis might tell you whether or not something works. What it won't necessarily tell you is whether farmers, for example, are willing to use it because they think it's too, use a particular intervention because they think it might be too expensive or it might have knock-on impacts. And of course, it doesn't necessarily tell you how much it might cost if you were to fund farmers to be able to do that. So I know some of the work Adrien's been doing has been thinking about how you can combine evidence syntheses with things like land area, which might then help you maybe perhaps in the future calculate some of that cost, I think, hasn't it, Adrien? Have I got that right? Or is that a step too far at the moment?
Not so I'm not sure I really understand the link with any commercial. It depends because I understood the question. The way I understood the question was, can you have biased results from trials made for commercial purposes? Or maybe I misunderstood the question.
Yeah.
But
Maybe that's what it meant. I wasn't quite sure either, but yes, that could be a potential issue as well.
But indeed, you see very clearly in the idea behind these rough estimate studies, because in the next study we will look at nutrient balance, and so what also when you implement the farming practices supported by the CAP. Do you improve the environment, but also do you also improve your yields? What are the economic consequences for farmers? And it's something that is very important to consider as well, because one of the primary objectives of the CAP is to ensure sustainable revenues for farmers, sustainable economic activity. So yes, indeed, it's all interlinked.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. Any other questions, Ryan?
So just on that point, Kate has sent through a reference to a paper about codes, which is just stating the field of commercial determinants in health, CDOH, refers to the commercial products, pathways, and practices that may affect health.
Okay, so maybe in agriculture, that would be where people use evidence, perhaps, to design agrochemicals, for example, and then push their agrochemicals. Is that the sort of equivalent that we might be thinking about, perhaps? Okay. Yeah, it's certainly a possibility, I would think.
This may bring some bias. If it is, what I understand is that if you have in your pool of studies, you have many that are somehow driven by commercial purposes, that then you may end up with a bias, and this I think it's a risk, of course. So it's somehow I think it's otherwise it's actually difficult to label the kind of evidence that you get. You would have to label somehow the different kinds of experiments, some coming from commercial purposes, or some coming for whatever purposes. But I don't think I don't think this is possible until now, at least. I mean,
I'd like to hope that if we're using proper structured systematic review methodologies, that would then, because we're treating every primary research study the same, we wouldn't bias. Whoever's funded that shouldn't be a bias, because we're looking at the experimental design. But of course, what we can't do is if there's anything that's perhaps not been made publicly available because it doesn't meet commercial.
Certainly, one of the criteria for quality is looking at the funder of the original data, right? So in this case, there might be some possibility of mapping at least the original money, the original funds.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm aware of time. We've only actually got 2 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is, hold on, would you like to ask live? Okay, Kate, if you have anything you want to add to that very quickly, please do so. We've only got 2 minutes, so we need 1 minute to just do our final question, but please ask if you think we've missed your point. Please make your point or ask your question. I can see you're now available on the panel. Okay, so I'm not sure that Kate's may be able to do that, so never mind. So what we'll do then, I just wanted to ask one final question of each of everybody on the panel then. So going back, we spoke about key challenges. What are our key priorities then? So what would be your key priority to try and build and enhance our evidence synthesis capacity for agriculture or agri-food systems? I'm going to work backwards this time and start with Damien.
Okay, so I think there is different priorities. I think there is priorities for communicating with policymakers, but I won't make these points. I think in terms of scientific priorities, I think the main challenges are here to provide information that are useful for farmers. On saying this, it's very difficult, but it means, as we already say, that we have to have more precise information, some spatial information, some combination of practices, and so on and so on. So it's a very new challenge. It's a new area to how to deal with this, because currently we are doing with randomized control design, that is very good to have statistical programs and so on, but it's very difficult. It does not represent reality. So we are providing evidence that does not match what farmers are doing. So it's very problematic, and it's very difficult to guide, to provide new future for farmers if we are not saying the right things. So I think that's the main priority, is to provide more useful information for farmers and for policymakers.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Damien. Adrien.
Yeah, I think to my perspective, one of the priorities, and I think I really liked what Damien presented on the when he said that, I put it with my words, but the scientific community needs to work together to really harmonize the way data is collected in the studies. So not everyone is doing his study on his side, and so it can all be gathered in very clear and identifiable database that can easily be used for either for farmers or for policymakers. And to me, yes, what I take from this conversation is really this this need.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Andrea.
Well, I will add on only this point. I think what we found after looking at all this literature that we've been collecting at the synthesis level is that people would still think quite in a narrow perspective, looking at the effect of a single practice over a single impact, right? A single indicator of only on soil carbon or, for instance, on soil erosion. While here, what we need is evidence regarding systems of practices, just like Lynn was pointing out, and also in my example on agroecological approach, right? So systems of practices, because this is the reality. Farmers put in place systems of practices, not just few or one, the effect of a single thing. So and the effect must be studied, and let's say the evidence at least must be collected over a broad range of impacts. So we have to work, at least as scientists, with a more holistic view of what is an ecosystem, and so to at least at the sense, because I know that primary studies, primary literatures are limited very much by funding and also by expertise. So one may focus on his topic, which is biodiversity, I don't know, or maybe soil or etc. But at least when we synthesize information, we must do it thinking about the whole picture, I think.
Yeah, really good point. Thank you. So I guess for me, I'm just thinking really generally, and maybe thinking it would be really useful to know what the key questions are that farmers and policy makers need answering. And also, I think, again, this idea of actually thinking about gathering together an understanding of all the people that are working in this field, because there's so many of us. And I think, unless you go to an event that's perhaps organised by somebody, Andrea, you obviously had your event fairly recently, if you're not invited to a particular event or you don't happen to attend, often you don't know what other people are doing. And I think it would be really good if we can try and build up a database so we can build up our community, know what everybody is actually doing. So hopefully we're going to some way towards doing that through events such as this as well. So
eventually organize an enlarged event, like let's say what could be a conference meeting or so in this kind of scientific community, like something specific for evidence synthesis in agriculture, and do organize, for instance, one first event or conference
Yeah.
with an let's call for abstract, and then I don't know. But of course,
yeah, absolutely. So that could be something our network can do. The network that I presented, of course, which is good because we have funding to do that, which is fantastic. Okay, anybody got any last points they want to make? Anything they think they wanted to speak about that we haven't had chance to? No. So I just want to say thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, of course, to Lynn, who wasn't here. And thank you, of course, to Ryan for organising as well and setting this up. And yeah, best of luck for the rest of the conference, Ryan. So thank you, guys, Adrien, Andrea, Damien, much appreciated.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very
for
much.
the invitation. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.